Next up, I'm really excited to introduce Collin Whitehead, head of brand studio and UX writing at Dropbox, where he's been leading creative teams for the past 5 years. Collin previously was the executive producer at companies like West and Goodby Silverstein and Partners. He's also an alum of the University of Wyoming, which is cool. I want to talk to him about Wyoming if anybody's from Wyoming out there. And if you have any questions for Collin, again, there's a little Q&A box. Drop it in there. We'll try to answer as many as we can. We can also use some of your questions for some follow-up as well later. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Collin. Yeah, come on, man. Let's go.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here as well. I think this is a story that I've been really excited to share. And it's been on my to-do list for a couple of years. And I suppose that I sort of decided to wait until we were in a global pandemic with quarantine and, you know, a couple of toddlers in the house for me to share the story. But I'm excited to share it. And we'll see how it goes. Be patient with me as we kind of figure this out. So this is a picture of me when I was a toddler. And well, let me remove this remote control here for you. We'll move this so you're not staring at it. There we go. Better. All right. Thanks. Okay, so this is me, and I know what you're thinking. That doesn't look like me, and that is because I shaved that day at school. And I did that because my dad was very strict. My dad was an Air Force colonel, and my mother was an artist from Los Angeles. And so it's kind of very fitting that I found my career kind of bridging the sort of rigidity of impact and the things that I took from my father and the creativity and artistry from my mother. And I began my career as a producer, and it netted me here at Dropbox, where I run the brand studio and the UX writing teams, as Enrique mentioned. And we had an interesting experience a couple of years ago when Dropbox IPO'd. And this is sort of a rare project. It's not one that you come across every day, and it was a bit of a black box for me coming into it. So I want to share a little bit as transparently as I can about what that is like. And I just share that knowing that probably not a lot of people are going to IPO this year. But I think the lessons that we kind of learned in this process apply to your next round of funding or going through an acquisition or just kind of general principles of narrative. So this is the list of deliverables. So we have a testing the waters deck, we have a roadshow deck, we have an S1, and I actually have it here, keep it kind of with me, sleep with it under my pillow. And that's the filing with the SEC. And the roadshow is just something that the executive team is going to go through and tour with all of the investors. There's a founder's letter, there's a press kit, and then depending on who you list with, like the NASDAQ, they will give you a media buy that incorporates a full campaign with out-of-home print, etc. And then there's a roadshow video, which is sort of the kind of the largest deliverable in this. It's a 25-minute long film that kind of covers a lot of the narrative of your company. And you know, normally when you're in a communication design problem, you have your users as stakeholders, you have leadership, etc. But in this process, you get people like the SEC, you get a lot of legal folks weighing in, a lot of feedback from banks, the board members, potential investors, and then you get some you know, former employees, early employees that have lots of interesting opinions. So, you know, obviously it's a tense moment and it's high pressure, but it's one that, you know, is hopefully worth the effort. And oftentimes you have to do it in a really short amount of time. So all of those deliverables that just mentioned, including 4 new kind of videos and then the longer format one that I mentioned, were executed inside of 7 weeks. When you're choosing to go public as a company, obviously there's a lot of factors in the decision, but timing is one that's pretty important. And so when the window opens up, you take it and you kind of jump in. And it's also something that's highly secretive. So of this group of people, I was really only able to take 5 with me, kind of under the tent, legally, as it were, through this process. And, there's sort of 2 aspects in the narrative of an IPO. On the one side, you have the financial data, the tables and charts that every analyst is going to be pouring through. And all of that stops at a certain point. And that point is kind of the day that information is given. And everything else in the future is just storytelling. And it doesn't matter if it's a financial story or more of a brand or narrative story. It's something that is a promise that you're giving, and it's a story that you're telling. And for Dropbox, our story is, we came on the scene, 10 plus years before our IPO, and we were a leader in this sort of file storage and sharing market, and had established a position as just that. But we were wanting to transition to a different category. So FSS is file sync and share, and CVC is content-based collaboration. And so we wanted to be something a little bit more than just that passive storage. And we wanted to use financial data in our creative storytelling. And so these 2 worlds meeting was kind of an interesting juxtaposition. And so we use lots of our typical tricks that we use in storytelling. We shoot on a green screen so we can mess with graphics and perspective. We're adding in A and B cameras so that we can tighten up the edit and jump in between if there's any issues. We're obviously doing color correction. We're adding in B-roll and graphics and title cards, product shots. And we're adding a little bit of sizzle with customer stories like the Golden State Warriors. We got to go out to SNL, who are Dropbox customers. We shot with Pinterest, actually. They were gracious enough to let us kind of tell how they used Dropbox Paper. And then we actually shot with Edward Norton in New York when he was filming a film called Motherless Brooklyn. And interestingly enough, we actually had to cut this from the IPO video because the banks tend to leak information every now and then to potential investors, and we didn't want that getting out. And because we couldn't pay him and further complications, we had to kind of remove that. So it was a bit of a saga, but cool experience. And all of those things are really great and they're interesting. And they're the sort of sexier side of the storytelling and the video production, which was kind of the key deliverable in this. But this slide right here is actually the crux of the real problem that we solved in our IPO. And it was an incredibly complex narrative that we tried to distill down into something really, really simple with balancing speaker parts and sort of a coherent narrative that told our story. And so we used a rubric. It's a simple rubric, but it's one that is sort of tried and true for us. We, of course, define the business problem. We define our audience. We define the single most important message. We talk about authenticity and craft. We question ourselves, and we ask questions about, is it recognizable as Dropbox, and does it break through? So, when we talk about the business objectives, I actually called a friend that I made at one of the banks who was an underwriter for Dropbox when we IPO'd, and talked to him a little bit last night about, the definition of success for IPO. And it means a few different things. Obviously, setting your pricing successfully is really, really important. He called it an equity story, which I take to just mean the narrative, the market timing, and then a stable shareholder base, which is sort of an interesting problem because you don't just want to sell your tens of millions of shares. You want the right people to buy those shares. So you want long-term investors, you know, your T. Rowe Price, Fidelity, people are going to go into mutual funds and 401ks, things like that, instead of the growth investors who are going to do high turnover. So actually having a clear narrative is super important, because that narrative is going to get passed on from banks to other investors. And this was the narrative, essentially, that Dropbox stock has value. This is our number one most important key message. And this is our audience, right? It's banks, it's Wall Street. It was a unique audience to me, with lots of different considerations. But then we also had that pass-through audience of the investors that they would be talking to, doing their investor education about our stock. And then we asked ourselves, you know, like, how can we make this authentic to us? This is a screenshot from the founders letter that we made from Drew and Arash. And here at the bottom, they sign off, instead of with a sincerely, a cupcake, which was one of our company values that meant sort of surprise and delight, joy, and all of these other things. And then we have the sort of icons, the little carrots of the blue and green triangles from a product that was for Dropbox paper. And so the little notes of authenticity that we wanted to add were really important. And then we wanted to make it really, really compelling. So this is an example of the data that we would get from finance about quarterly cohort expansion economics, which just means that when a team joins Dropbox, eventually they expand over time as that team grows and is using the products a little bit more. And so we said, okay, step one, yes, we can take that and we can, you know, dial up the graphic design and the layout of the page, but we can add even more, right? We can add motion design, we can add voiceover, we can add a little bit of music, and then it starts to become a more significant piece of storytelling. So I'll just play that part here.
This chart shows our monthly revenue cohort expansion over the last 5 years. And as you can see from these upward sloping monthly revenue curves, every cohort that we've acquired has consistently expanded in value over time.
You know, just from, you know, from this, and how that makes a difference in the narrative and the storytelling. So, and then
this chart,
we asked our question of, does it break through? So inside this S1 is actually a gatefold. You know, as soon as you open this up, you know, it kind of was something that was unique to us, a little bit different. This was, you know, part of our rebrand and doing the co-creation imagery, giving credit to the artists, and talking about the sort of unintentional juxtapositions and how people collaborating can make new and more interesting things. And kind of every element that we could pepper in that was unique to us, we tried to do that. And then there were moments like this, which it still to this day makes my eyes bleed a little bit and is uncomfortable to look at, because this was something that the banks loved as they tried to understand what content-based collaboration means. And for the life of me, there was probably not a better way to communicate this than doing what we did to this logo. And so even though it pained me, you know, from a design perspective, this was something that we allowed to go through. We saw it was super effective. And it was like one of those interesting compromises that you make in the process, knowing exactly who your audience is. And so at the end of the day, when we distill down that narrative, the full arc of what you have to go through when you're talking about your company and IPO, this is what it came down to. The component parts were telling the origin and evolution of our company, talking about our future, doing a deep dive into our products and how they work, telling really, really compelling stories about our customers, talking about how we're different, going through the mechanics of our business model, going through all of the financial kind of high, hard ones and big numbers, wrapping all of that up, and all the while establishing sort of rapport and confidence in the leadership team that is sharing all that material. So, you know, in New York on listing day was kind of an experience unlike any other that I've had. And by all accounts from employee side or investor side or, you know, on the bank's successful experience for sure. And, you know, what that looks like essentially is, you know, we offered 36 million shares We had an initial price range of $16 to $18. We had an opening high that day of $31 a share. And that put our valuation above our previous at $12 billion. And I think it's really, really important here to make a caveat that design will not make an IPO successful, but design can position a successful IPO to build investor confidence and make it believable that it can be as successful as possible. And just sharing a few of the lessons learned that hopefully apply beyond an IPO moment, really is that the design process scales to any situation. It's the beauty and simplicity of the design process, that messages can be tailored once you understand an audience, that really that narrative and that story creates value. And that value is perhaps never more apparent, the communication value of narrative to dollars than in an IPO process. Another one is that the reality is that narrative is really hard to nail. And for us, we were rushing to get it together. And I wish that we had started a little bit sooner and kind of nurtured that. The fact that we had to shoot 4 net new customer stories inside of 6 days was problematic, to say the least. And something that I wish we had more of a bank of. And then sweating the details. So essentially, like those small little notes that show up in your execution, in the design, are noticed even by people who know nothing about design, bankers who pay attention to details, analysts, and all of it signals to those investors that you are buttoned up. And if you're buttoned up here, you're buttoned up in other areas. And the last big takeaway for me was I don't think that we had ever really bolted on directly to a finance org. We would go through product design to product to a business strategy team, or we would go through a marketing team to a business strategy team. And in this case, we got attached straight onto a finance team. And once that language barrier was broken down a little bit, it was kind of an amazing thing to watch how designers were solving real business problems, understanding, the users in a new way, and how we also were able to build empathy for our process and understanding how our craft functioned and could elevate the narrative of kind of the story that Dropbox wanted to tell. And the last thing is, it was so painful, even though it was one of my favorite projects. I would be very happy to help anyone that is going through this. I am a social media recluse, so the only way to get a hold of me is just emailing me. But truly, I think it's a really challenging experience, and if there's any lessons that I can share about it, or even some of the assets as reference, whether it's a round of funding or an IPO, I think it's really good and important for us to be more transparent about these types of things, because as designers and creatives, I think getting more involved in business directly is going to improve our craft and kind of elevate the industry. And that's it.